and we're reading from chapter 22, Jack Frost. Hello friends, welcome back to Riverwood Cabin. I'm Rosie Boom and I'm reading to you from Where Lions Roar at Night. Book 1 of the Barn Chronicles, and we're reading from chapter 22, Jack Frost. They had another visitor that night. Jack Frost came while they were all sleeping and turned everything silver white. When Millie woke up and looked out the loft window, she couldn't believe her eyes. Pharaoh stood like a pale statue on a field of white. She flew down the stairs and ran outside. The next minute, she came back in holding a thick, round piece of ice. "Look at this," she called out to Jake and Sam, who were just coming down the stairs. "It's from Angel's bowl. All the troughs are covered in ice." She threw the ice into the sink, shaking her cold pink hands, and then followed the boys who had already run outside. "For goodness sake, put some shoes on," Mum called after them. Ellie went to the door and looked outside. All along the fence line were beautiful spider webs, laden with dewdrops and sparkling like jewel necklaces. She came back in and looked at the thermometer that hung on the barn wall. 1 degree! No wonder it's so jolly cold in here. "I'll say," exclaimed Kate, "but I was warm in my bed. I guess we just need to dress up really warm." "That's right," agreed Mum. "It's all part of the adventure. But I must say, even though I was warm in bed last night, my nose and my cheeks were stinging with the cold." After a hot breakfast, Dad carried in armloads of firewood and filled the large cane basket beside the homewood. "Our first frost, eh? We'll need to keep the fire going today, I think." Mum nodded. "I'll put a pot of vegetable soup on too. That'll be nice for lunch." "Look at my breath," said Jacob as he came back inside and puffed out a cloud of steam. Soon all the children were huffing and puffing at each other like a gaggle of dragons. Outside on the porch, the washing hanging on the clothes horse steamed in the morning sun. "I love homeschooling on a day like this," said Ellie, when they were all sitting under quilts and blankets on the sofa. "Imagine going to school on a cold day like this." Josiah rolled his eyes. "School might be a darn sight warmer than our barn." Mum laughed. "Yes, it probably would be. I remember having Latin classes in one of the older rooms at my school. It had a large pot-belly stove in it, which the teacher used to keep burning. It was so deliciously warm in that room. I always wondered if that was why my head was so fuzzy during Latin classes." "I know exactly what you mean," said Josiah. "I have the same fuzzy problem here by our fire." Millie tucked her feet under the warm blanket. Angel was curled up beside her with her nose on Millie's lap. She never missed devotions. Shasta jumped lightly onto the sofa and smooched around Angel, whose eyes were warm and friendly. After rubbing his head against Angel's furry face a few times, Shasta sank into the blanket on Millie's legs and began to purr loudly. Millie stroked his warm, striped fur and smiled contentedly. Mum always seemed especially happy to read to them for ages on a cold morning like this. That afternoon, Millie caught Peony and brushed her for ages. Her coat had grown quite thick and long, and Millie loved to lay her face against it and feel its warmth. Ellie helped her pick Peony's hooves and then saddle up. "May I have the first ride today? You always get to go first." Millie shot her a grumpy look. She wished Ellie didn't like riding so much, then she'd be able to have Peony all for herself. "All right then, but don't take too long." Ellie swung up into the saddle. "Will you tell Mum to come out and watch?" Mum soon appeared holding the video camera. "I'll get some good footage of you riding," she called to Ellie. "Show me your stuff." Ellie gave Peony a small kick and urged her into a canter. "Good," called Mum. "Keep your heels down and sit deep in the saddle." Peony cantered up to Mum and Ellie reined her in. "That's great, Ellie," said Mum, giving Peony a pat on the neck. "But I wasn't ready to video you. Do it again and I'll get you this time. Go over by the kahikatea tree and canter back towards me." Millie watched as Ellie turned Peony around at the tree and gave her a kick. Peony broke into a canter and headed towards the barn. Just then, Jake ran out from behind the woodpile and kicked the soccer ball. Peony started sideways, and Millie watched as Ellie began to slide to the left. Everything seemed to move into slow motion. Slowly, so slowly, Ellie slid from the saddle and fell with a thump to the ground. The second she hit the earth, everything kicked back into normal speed. Peony exploded into a frenzy of bucking and then took off, galloping away from the barn, tossing her head wildly. A tan and white streak shot beneath the fence and tore after her, barking excitedly. Ellie leaped to her feet and ran after them. "Wonderful!" cried Mum, laughing. "I got it all on video." It made a good showing that night after dinner. "Look at that wretched dog," said Dad. "Always wanting to be on anything that seems like a fight." He glowered in fun at Angel, and she grinned back at him. The next day, another light frost sprinkled the ground. Mum announced at breakfast that they were having visitors for lunch and that she wanted everyone to have a good clean up of their rooms before school started. Millie groaned. "If the boys weren't so jolly messy, the loft would be fine." "It's not just the boys, Millie," replied Mum. Millie trudged upstairs. She pulled back the heavy curtain that separated the boys' side from the girls' side. Sure enough, Lego lay all over the boys' floor, as well as pyjamas and other clothes. But when she looked at the girls' side, it was just about as bad. Kate was usually so tidy, and Millie liked to keep her area tidy too, most of the time. But their floor was covered with clothes and scrapbooking paper and books and material. She and Kate had been making patchwork quilts together, and the sewing machine was still out. She picked up her clothes and put them away, and then quickly shoved a few things under the bed. School raced past, and soon they heard their friend's van coming up the drive. After a noisy lunch, they all went outside and began to show the visitors around the land. Angel followed them, happy to be amongst all the children. They followed the riverbank along from Lantern Waste to Beaver's Bank. Suddenly, Angel shot in front of them and started barking up into a karaka tree. The children crowded around them. Angel stood up against the trunk, yapping hysterically. The next moment, a furry face with big round eyes peeped out through the leaves. "It's a possum!" shouted Sam. Dad looked up into the tree. "Joe, run and get my gun." Joe hurried back to the barn. Millie watched Mum move away. She wouldn't want to be anywhere around when the possum was shot. "It's so cute," said Jacob in a sad voice. "I know," said Dad, "but they are a real pest. They destroy the native bush and they eat the birds' eggs. I don't enjoy killing them either, but it has to be done." "I'll shoot it," offered one of the visiting boys when Josiah arrived with the gun. "I've got a gun at home." Millie looked over to where Mum stood with her back to them, holding her hands over her ears. Bang! The gunshot echoed across the river and through the bush. Birds scattered into the sky, screeching and squawking. The possum fell with a big splash into the river. Angel scrambled down the bank and plunged in, yapping constantly. She dog-paddled over to where the possum was beginning to sink and caught it in her mouth. "It's bigger than she is!" shouted Millie. They watched as Angel swam round and round, trying to find a place where she could drag her prize out. But the river bank was steep and muddy. She scrambled frantically at the bank but fell backwards into the water. "Help her, Dad!" cried Sam. But Dad was watching her with a grin on his face. "Stupid dog! She'll never get out while she's holding it." Angel began swimming randomly around the river, grimly holding on to the possum. Slowly she began to sink lower and lower until all they could see was her nose and two amber eyes. "Stupid dog," said Dad again. "Let it go." But Angel would rather drown than lose her prize. Millie watched her eyes disappear under the water. Just the tip of her nose was showing. "Save her, Joe!" she shouted. Josiah climbed down the bank and grabbed hold of some tree roots. Then he leaned out across the water and grabbed the drowning dog by her collar and hauled her up. All the kids laughed at the sight of the bedraggled dog being lifted through the air with the big possum hanging from her mouth. Josiah dumped them both on the bank and then climbed up himself. Only then did Angel let go of the possum and shake herself vigorously. Millie burst out laughing. She looked like a miniature lion, with all her fluffy hair sticking out in every direction and a mane of fluffed-out fur around her neck. She looked up proudly at them and smiled. "You silly dog," laughed Dad. That night, much to Mum's disgust, the possum lay draped over one of the fence posts outside the barn. Sam was keen to learn how to skin it and make his own coon hat. "I'd rather you just buried it," Mum told Dad. Dad laughed. "I'm sure you would. But boys need to learn how to do this sort of thing." "And just when did you learn how to skin a possum?" Dad shrugged with a grin. Then he glanced up at the sky. Millie followed his eyes. The sky had a strange colour to it. It looked uneasy and unsettled. "I've got a feeling we're in for a bit of a storm tonight," said Dad. "We'll leave the possum skinning for another day."